Hello everyone, it's Robin the Delta Crafter and I want to thank you for joining me for another video on my YouTube channel. Today I'm going to be sharing with you 3 different ways to color in large stamps. Now sometimes large stamps can be intimidating because if you are not you don't feel comfortable with like alcohol markers or maybe even zig clean color markers, you may be intimidated on different ways or how you can actually add color to a large stamp. I'm going to share with you 3 different ways that are beginner friendly and forgiving, but also provide great results. Let's get started. So all of today's projects or cards are going to be made using an embossing technique. So just using embossing, heat embossing, and some embossing powder. So I'm just going to start out now by doing the first image. This image is actually going to be done on watercolor paper. So if you've ever used watercolor paper before, you know that it's thick and it's textured. So I'm going to make sure that my image is inked up really, really well. And then I'm going to use some good pressure to stamp that image onto that textured watercolor paper. And again, because it's textured, I am actually going to stamp this two times. Notice I've also included a sentiment in there, so that sentiment will be stamped and heat embossed as well. I'm bringing in some white embossing powder, so any white embossing powder you have in your stash will work. I'm going to be using 3 different types of embossing powders on these projects today. So just whatever you have in your stash will work. When you're using embossing powder, I always like to start melting my embossing powder from the back. This paper, again, is really thick, so you want to start on the back and then switch to the front and then continue melting your powder. Let's get into the first technique, liquid watercolors. So I'm going to be using a couple of liquid watercolors from Hero Arts. We're going to be using pink and indigo. The label for the pink one got ripped off a little bit, but you can see there that that blue color is called indigo. And if you have liquid watercolors or you have dried watercolors, either one will work for this technique. I'm using liquid watercolors here, and I'm just going to take the dropper and I'm actually going to drop a couple of drops of that watercolor onto the watercolor paper, right kind of in the middle of my image, or make a triangle on my image. Then I'm going to come in with my distress sprayer filled with water, and I'm just going to spritz water directly onto the paper and onto the ink. This technique that I'm using with the liquid watercolors is going to give us a kind of an abstract look to our finished product. It's not going to be all perfectly within the lines of the embossing, which is one of the things that I like about it. It does add some edginess to the finished image. So you can just keep spritzing a little bit of water on there to get your watercolor to move around. And you can spritz as much as you want or as little as you like. You can also bring in a paper towel to blot up some of that extra ink. And then of course you can use a wet paintbrush to spread some of the ink around. Now I'm pretty happy with kind of the puddles and the dark and the light that I have going on. So I'm going to go ahead and hit my image with my heat tool to kind of dry that look in place. Remember that we have that sentiment stamped at the top and heat embossed at the top. So that's where we're going to use the indigo. I just put a drop of that indigo onto my my glass craft mat, and I just put my wet paintbrush in there and ran it across the sentiment. I end up making this a little bit darker a little bit later on, and you'll see that in the finished product. But with that, our first technique is complete. The second technique, we're going to be using some ink blending. Now, those of you that have been around my channel for a while, you know ink blending is my jam. But what we're going to do differently with this particular technique is we're going to ink blend first. So I'm going to be using this large underwater image from Hero Arts, which, by the way, all of the images I'm using today are from Hero Arts. And I'm going to kind of have that over to the side and have that as a reference as I go in and do my ink blending. I'm using a couple of distress inks in Abandoned Coral, Salvaged Patina, and tea dye. You can use, whatever inks you have on hand that will that work well for ink blending. I have a couple of different sizes of brushes, and I actually am going to use one of my larger brushes as well. And you'll see that in just a minute. Um, but I'm going to put down some abandoned coral in the general area of where I'm going to place my stamp. I want most of the underwater image to be inked up in that abandoned coral. Then I'm going to come in below that and kind of give us a sea floor with some sand. So that's where the tea dye is going to come in. We're just going to create a sandy sea floor at the bottom of our panel here. This image is like the first technique. Is going to be very loose. It's not tight within the lines of the stamped image. It is very like I said, it's very loose and very figurative. So now I'm going to come in with the Salvaged Patina. I'm using my larger ink blending brush here. And I'm going to lay down a little bit of Salvaged Patina. But I'm not going to go like all the way up to the abandoned coral. Because again, I have that image over to the side. And I'm using it as a guide. And in just a moment, I'm going to bring in that image and kind of lay it onto to the panel and kind of figure out exactly where I want it to be. So that's going to tell me where I need to add more of which ink color. So that image kind of fans out at the top. So I'm adding a little bit more of the abandoned coral at the top, and that's going to complete the ink blending. Because we've laid down quite a bit of ink, we want to go ahead and hit this panel with the heat tool to kind of speed up the drying process. You need that panel to be completely dry before you go in to do your stamping for your heat embossing. Otherwise, if it's a little bit damp or wet, then you'll pick up some stray embossing powder, and you don't want that to ruin your image. So we're just going to do like we did before and just go in and stamp our image with the Versamark ink. That's the sticky embossing ink, and we're going to stamp it. And I'm going to use my Rabbit Hole Designs powder tool to cover my entire my entire panel with some powder before I emboss, and then ink it up with that Versamark ink and stamp my image. So for this image, I'm going to be using the sand embossing powder from Hero Arts. This is one of my favorite embossing powders. This embossing powder is absolutely stunning. You'll see when you get to see the close-up image at the end. It looks like sand in the jar, but when you melt it, there's some of those larger flakes melt into this beautiful metallic gold. And it just gives the it really does look like sand. And I'd love to use it whenever I'm using or creating any type of image that has to do with the ocean or sea or anything like that. Once that's melted, we'll be done with that panel. So let's move on to technique 3, which is using distress crayons. Now, I am pretty new to distress crayons. I have a few, but I haven't used them a lot. But I thought they were the perfect medium to use for coloring these large stamps. So off camera, I went ahead and ran through the embossing technique using that Versamark ink. And now I'm covering the image with some black embossing powder. I also stamped a sentiment when I stamped the image, so we're going to apply that black embossing powder to both of those, melt it, and then we're going to get ready to use our distress crayons. So I have a yellow and a green distress crayon, and we're going to work that crayon and melt it with a water brush that's filled with plain water, so clean water there. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to take that yellow and just scribble some of that all over the petals of the sunflowers. Don't feel like you need to color in all of the petals on your flower. When you apply that water brush, to these distress crayons, that's going to move that distress crayon around, and it's going to fill in the all your petals very, very nicely. So you'll see here, I'm just starting to kind of get my brush wet by squeezing squeezing the barrel a little bit, and I'm going to apply some water to that distressed crayon, and that distressed crayon is going to move like butter. It really does provide quite a bit of color and vibrancy to these sunflowers. This particular yellow also has a little bit of shimmer in it, and hopefully you'll be able to see that in the finished product. So now I'm going to take the green and apply that to the leaves of all my sunflowers here. Just scribble a little bit of that into the leaves of the sunflowers. And again, I'm going to use my paintbrush, my water brush rather, and kind of melt that distressed crayon into the paper. Sorry about my head, guys. I was trying to kind of get a good look at what I was doing to make sure that I covered all my areas well. I don't have a brown distress crayon, so I decided to go ahead and fill the centers of those flowers using that same green distress crayon, but just with a lighter hand. And with that, this panel will be finished. So let's take a closer look at the cards that we made today. So here is our liquid watercolor card. I love the depth that I was able to achieve with that watercolor. Here is our ink blended card. And now you can get a better look at the gold flecks that are in that sand embossing powder. Absolutely love it. And then finally, here is our card we created with distress crayons. I think I'm going to be using distress crayons a lot more in my future creations. So stay tuned and make sure you follow along to see how I use those. I want to thank you for joining me for another video on my YouTube channel. If you have enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing to the channel to become a part of the Delta Crafter family. As always, you can find me on Instagram and Facebook at The Delta Crafter, as well as on my website and blog at thedeltacrafter.com. All of the products, or as many of the products that I can link for you, I will have them linked below in the description box. Again, I hope you have enjoyed this video, and until next time, enjoy!